Welcome to the Unlist. Once again, I am filming from the nondescript void instead of the normal background of my home collection. Sometimes I like to do things like this. One, because it reminds me of how I used to film all my old videos from work, basically, and I had a very neutral place that I could film from. So every once in a while, I like going back to that. And two, whenever I do videos from home in front of my collection, I almost feel obligated to show and tell bottles, and I don't really like doing that, honestly. I don't like showing and telling bottles. Not really. Not every video has to be about, look what I got, right? So when I do a video like this, it forces me to make a conversation about something that's not in my hand. And I think a lot of you guys originally valued my channel because I could talk about things without having it in my hand, right? Now, there are people who are the exact opposite and who want to see everything in my hand and flashy graphics and informatics put on screen and closed captioning and alt text, and they want like buying guide suggestions, and they basically want me to turn into a regular YouTube channel, and I constantly push back against that. I'm like, no, thank you. I'm not looking to improve my channel to make it more useful. This is not the kind of channel for someone who is really just looking to buy the next club banger or looking to build out a wardrobe of relevant, fashionable, attention-getting fragrances, nor am I in that space where I try to curate a certain mindset. So if you're someone who wants to worship at the Church of Oak Moss, you're in the wrong place for that. You're also in the wrong place for only naturals, no synthetics. I just get on here and I talk about perfume. And I talk about history of perfume. I talk about taste in perfume. Sometimes I point a mirror at the community and I talk about the community. And when I talk about the community, I get a lot of people upset, but I don't really care because those aren't people who would be really following my channel anyway. Most people who get upset at something I have to say are not subscribers, so I can't be bothered. So today's video is really just more storytelling, right? You guys liked my little fragrant stories thing and figured I would do a part 2 about that. And the cool thing about part 2 is that I can just tell stories about fragrances without having to have a bottle in my hand, because these are periods of my life. These are events. These aren't necessarily needing to show you the bottle. So I think I'd show the bottle a little bit in the first one because I was at home and they were handy, but I'm not home and they're not handy, so you're just going to have to know what I'm talking about when I talk about it. No big deal, right? Who cares? So this first fragrant story of mine is actually going to be the story that really helped move me away from that mindset of men only wear men's cologne and women only wear women's perfumes. Like, that's a big debate that constantly rages. It honestly rages more on base notes than I think it does outside of base notes, because you got a lot of old, very conservative people there who are like sticks in the mud, and they have this sort of orthodoxy worldview of, you know, guys wear powerhouses and colognes and women wear perfumes and stuff, and anything that doesn't fall into a bottle of poison or a bottle of one man show, it's not in the orthodoxy. Again, it's the whole Church of Oak Moss kind of thing. But you see the gender thing rage a little bit in places like Fragrantica, but I feel like most people in Fragrantica are too busy really just taking the piss on each other anyway. People saying this guy below me is an asshole and he's wrong and I'm right, and that's the review. They don't even talk about the fragrance. They just talk about how the guy below them sucks, and that's the content of their review. That kind of weird, like, just Reddit 4chan sort of Kiwi Farms kind of behavior is really prevents any actual community siding with A or B. It's one big dog eat dog shit flinging fest, really. So, you know, these kind of debates about X versus Y or A versus B really can only happen in places like Base Notes, where there is sort of a semblance of community enough to the point where you're going to have, you know, different camps that have opposing views. So instead of having just everybody hating everyone else all the time, right? Constant, just high school levels of drama, which is where you get places like Fragrantica and Reddit, of course, too. You get that kind of stuff there, Oda jerks and all that sort of thing. But at least from what I've seen, the whole gender thing of men can only wear for men, pour homme and stuff, and women can or should only wear women's fragrances, and then of course the unisex stuff. Basically, for people who that have that opinion, unisex stuff is basically just women's stuff, right? Because if it's shared, then I don't want to touch it. So de facto, unisex is women's fragrances because the He-Man, Manly Man guys don't want to touch it. They won't wear a bottle of CK1. They won't wear something like that. So that just means men's stuff, women's stuff, and then unisex is more women's stuff. So, but what broke me of that, what really moved me away from that, was a girl I used to know. And I think I may have told this story elsewhere, but I don't think I've put it on a YouTube video. Stop me if I'm wrong, though. But her name was Jessica, and she was really into the whole sort of, I wouldn't exactly say metal, but she was into the whole gothic, industrial sort of punk thing. So, I mean, she listened to bands like AFI and Rammstein, I guess, if I'm doing it properly. She listened to stuff like KMFDM, The Birthday Massacre. She was into just a lot of like dark industrial electronic stuff, but then also heavier rock music too, but never like full on Cannibal Corpse or anything like that. She was never like into metal of that degree, but she just had that sort of Slipknot. She liked new metal bands, so Slipknot and Korn and all that. But she was the kind of girl that would wear camo pants, but the old style camo, not the current digital stuff, right? Like the old Vietnam era with like the cow patches looking like that kind of camo. She wore those camo pants, and then she would wear surplus army jackets, and then she would wear chains and spikes and the whole thing. The Doc Martens, got to have your Doc Martens, and she had like the taller ones, so they were like the 12-eye Doc Martens or whatever. And that was her vibe, you know, that whole sort of army surplus store, hot topic army surplus store combined sort of vibe. Listening to her in dark industrial sort of new metal rage rock stuff. And like the majority of her fragrances were men's fragrances. But I didn't really know this because when you're friends with somebody, you don't just say, let me see your perfume collection, right? You don't do that. It took me until, so she was a friend because she was the daughter. This is complicated, but this is how Baltimore works, guys. When you grow up in Baltimore, this is how it works. She was the daughter of a guy who was the brother of my mother's then boyfriend. Makes sense? My mother was dating somebody, and the guy she was dating, his brother's daughter, I was friends with. So eventually my mother and her boyfriend moved in together. So then that meant her boyfriend's brother would stop by with his daughter, and they would stay over sometimes, and she would sleep on the couch. And sometimes she would bring her perfumes with her and set them up on the little end table there on the end of the couch. And that's when I figured out that she was wearing men's perfume, because I'd smell her, but you don't. Again, you don't really comment on someone's perfume if you're not close to them, right? At least I don't. You know, you could give a compliment, say, "Hey, you smell nice," but you're not going to ask what it is, right? You don't ask what it is. I've told you that in past videos. But then she sets them out, and I'm like, okay. And I shit you not, guys. She had Crave by Calvin Klein, the plastic one. That's a men's fragrance. She had that. Not surprising because that's Crave was a sweet enough, fruity enough fragrance that a woman could actually get away with it. In that era, very similar to Coco Mademoiselle, very similar to Kenneth Cole, New York. It's not beyond the realms of reason for a woman to wear CK Crave and get away with it without someone second guessing. But she used to have this really musty sort of green smell that I could never place. And that musty green smell ended up being a bottle of Polo. I shit you not. She was wearing original green Polo from 1977. And it smelled so radically different on her than it did on myself and any other guy I've ever smelled wearing Polo. And that gives you an idea of how much a person's body chemistry, right? Body chemistry can alter a fragrance. And, you know, she wore this Polo and it didn't smell exactly like Polo. Like what you think Polo would smell, didn't smell exactly like that on her. So, now granted, she was also a smoker. So there was a smell of cigarette smoke on her clothes too. That probably also kind of informed how her perfumes smelled on her because she always had that slight smoking smell. So back in the 50s, women like her would have worn Cabochard, would have worn Tabac Blonde, would have worn Bandy, something that was good at covering cigarette smoke. But you know, we're talking the 2000s, right? So she wasn't going to wear Bandy. She wouldn't even know what Robert Piguet was, let alone have a bottle of Bandy. Just wouldn't, especially not in Baltimore, right? We're all a bunch of poor people living in the ghetto. But she wore Polo, CK Crave, and then she had Spark for Men by Spark for Men by Liz Claiborne. Oh my goodness, I almost said Calvin Klein. If you guys know Spark for Men, it's a very spicy, cinnamon, boozy kind of woody fragrance. And it's one of the better things that I almost did it again. Oh my God. It's one of the better things that Liz Claiborne did. It's a Harry Fremont fragrance, actually. Harry Fremont composed Spark for Men, and it's very good. And she wore that. So those were all men's stuff. She had Spark for Men by Liz Claiborne, Crave by Calvin Klein, which is probably why I keep wanting to say Calvin Klein, right? She had Crave, Spark, Polo, original Polo, and then she also had a bottle of Fierce, but bear in mind, Fierce was actually marketed as unisex back then. You might not think about it these days now, but in 2002, 2003, when Fierce was marketed, it didn't just have the abs on the bottle. It had women's front on the bottle too, and you saw guys and women both in the commercials talking about how I'm fierce and I'm unique and all this other stuff. So they really pushed that fragrance as being for everybody. Ultimately, guys wore it more than women did, but she had a bottle of Fierce. And then she had a bottle of Truth. So the funny thing was, the Truth was the women's version. So she had Calvin Klein Truth, women's version. And because her other fragrances were men's stuff, mostly, Fierce being, you know, sort of men's fragrance, but because all her other stuff was men's stuff, I assumed the Truth was too. So she moved out. We actually never saw each other again. My mother broke up with that guy, so then I never saw her father. I never saw her anymore. Wherever she is, I hope she's doing well for herself. But I hunted down a lot of those. I already owned Polo, so I didn't need to hunt that down. But I hunted down the other fragrances, Spark, Crave, and then when I bought the men's bottle of Truth, thinking that's what she had, right? Again, because I assumed, because they were all men's stuff she was wearing. When I got a men's bottle of Truth, I was shocked to learn it was not the same. And that's what broke my mind. That's where I went and snapped, because I'm like, she tricked me. Not intentionally, but she tricked me. All of her fragrances she had out were men's fragrances, except for Truth. And because I smelled those on her and assumed they were all men's fragrances, Truth had to be a man's fragrance too. Once I learned the truth, see, there's a little play on words there. Once I learned the truth of her tastes and learned that she was wearing all men's stuff, I assumed the truth was also. Because why not? These other ones are all men's stuff. And they smelled radically different on her than how they'd smelled on me. So why wouldn't the truth also just be another man's cologne that she was wearing? So when I blind bought the Truth Men Calvin Klein in like 2008 or 9 or whatever, and it showed up in the mail, and I sprayed it, I'm like, this is not the same thing. This is not the same thing. So then I went to the nearest Macy's or whatever, and I found the women's version, and I sprayed it, and I'm like, that's it. She was wearing that. And I swear to God that was a man's cologne, because all the rest of them were. But that one wasn't. I kept the men's Truth. And to this day, I still like it. I still use it. But once I had my mind basically blown by the fact that here's a girl wearing boy smells, right? This other one was also a boy smell. And I smelled it, and my brain perceived it as a boy smell. Then when I went and bought it, and it was wrong. It was actually the women's smell. But my brain had wired up the expectation of, well, this is probably another boy smell, because all her other stuff was boy smells. And then when I went to the counter and sprayed it and realized it was the For Her version, I was like, okay, so time is a flat circle. Nothing has meaning anymore. You know, if a sailing ship to nowhere, leaving any place, if the summer changed to winter, yours is no disgrace, right? I'm just like, okay, today is only yesterday's tomorrow. I'm just like, what's going on here? Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. The answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42, right? That's basically what my brain did. My brain just kind of went. And that's when I said, well, if that's how that works, right? If that's how that works, so let's try it in reverse. So I started taking some of my mother's old perfumes, because I still had my mother around me at that time. I wasn't completely on my own yet. I still had her around. She hadn't moved to Virginia yet. So I began digging up all of her old Avon bottles that I remember smelling as a kid that I fell in love with on her, right? Loved all her old Avon bottles. And she had a bottle of something called Bird of Paradise that I used to ask her to wear as a kid, because loved the way it smelled on her. So then I got the bottle of Bird of Paradise, and I sprayed it on me. And the opening smelled like I remembered, right? How when she wore it. But then once it dried down and it was on my skin, I was like, this smells like Old Spice. Like it had the same spicy, ambery, woody, big clove, okay? Big lavender was a part of it too. So it had this really big sort of oriental bay rum feeling to it. On my skin, it had that oriental bay rum feeling. It had that sort of Old Spice feeling on my skin. On her, it smelled completely different. And then I went, okay. And then I got her a bottle of Charlie, which I also loved. She would wear that when I was a kid. I asked her to wear Charlie. Real bright, fresh, sunny fragrance. And I sprayed it on me. Again, let it dry down, let it settle. Smelled the Charlie, and I'm like, well, on me, this is almost like in the same train of thought as Aramis or Capucci Poron from 67, which came out before Charlie, ironically, or even to some extent Lauder for Men, which I didn't know that fragrance at that time. I didn't know that yet, but my point is that's where it sat. that aldehyde, citrus, chypre vibe. And when a guy puts Charlie on and lets it dry down, you could put Charlie side by side with something like Homme de Grey, something like that, and it fits. And that's when I'm like, oh man, none of this stuff matters, And people who sit there and fight me tooth and nail with, what was it, Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant, where they come at you and they're like, they got blood and guts and veins in their teeth, right? Wanting to rip me apart and feed me to the sharks because they've got this weird culture war thing in their head, right? And I don't want to get into politics, but that's really what it is, guys. It's this culture war thing. And they come at you with the culture war thing. And I'm like, no, because in a vacuum, these perfumes smell more like the person wearing them than they do anything else. And that's why I don't really do the whole his, hers thing. Now, granted, some fragrances are really overtly trying to be gendered, really overtly trying. Obviously, a bottle of Koros, right? There are exceptions to every rule. But, Koros is really trying to be a manly smell, obviously. Something like the real sweet, sugary, sort of bubblegummy rosewater stuff, really trying to be feminine. Joy, not the Petou Joy, but the Dior Joy. Dior Joy is trying to really be feminine, going out of its way to be feminine, okay? So there are obviously fragrances that are trying, they're jumping through hoops, they're really trying to be masculine or feminine. One man show would be a hard ask for a lady to pull off. One man show would be a very hard ask. Maybe they could do it, but it'd be a hard ask, just like Britney Spears, Circus or whatever it's called would be a big ask for a guy to pull off. It's not impossible, but it'd be a big ask. So there are caveats here, guys. Don't get it in your head that I'm telling you to go run out and buy a bottle of Midnight Poison or something, or if you're a lady, I'm telling you to go run out and again buy a bottle of One Man Show and think that you're going to pull it off at the office, because you're probably not. But I'd say more than half of these, if not closer to 70-80% of these, the gender is kind of pointless once your body chemistry gets into the mix. And sometimes it really works, and then a lot of times it's just meh. A fragrance is going to be meh one way or the other. Doesn't matter what body it's on. If it's not a good fragrance, it's not a good fragrance. So, but yeah, that's one story, and she blew my mind with that. And another story I have, because I've spent most of the video covering this topic, but another story I have is about my good friend, my good friend from Baltimore. His father passed away recently, but him and his father reconnected, and he was trying to get his dad all of the fragrances he used to have in the late 80s and early 90s, because his dad went through some hard times. His dad went through some really hard times, and I don't want to get into the personal business of his father, but let's just say he got into some stuff that he shouldn't have got into, and it kind of ruined his life for a while and took all his money and stuff. But he was back on the straight and narrow before he passed away. This was not super long ago, but things were on the up at the time, and he really wanted to give his dad stuff that he had, but a lot of the fragrances his father liked were discontinued. Not all of them. He was able to get him a bottle of Drakkar Noir pretty easily. I mean, anybody can get a bottle of that pretty easily. But he had some stuff that was deep cut stuff. He had a bottle of iron. Now, there are two irons in the world. There's a Cody iron and a Avon iron, and the Avon is actually the easier one to get a hold of, but he had the Cody one, which is actually the tough one. And that's the one that's going to cost you $1 bazillion. But with my savvy of tracking down vintage discontinued fragrances, I spent more time and effort trying to get him a reasonably priced bottle of iron than I've ever wasted on myself. To get any unicorn or overly priced, I don't waste this kind of energy on myself. I just do without. I don't track down a bottle of Versailles Pour Homme or a bottle of 40 Love or whatever. I'd love to have them, sure, but I'm not going to bend over backwards and try and find a bottle. But for his father, I made an exception, and I did saved searches and all this other stuff, and eventually got a bottle of iron, a Cody bottle of iron for his dad. And then the easier part of it, honestly, was his dad wanted a bottle of Brut, but the old Brut with the glass bottle, Fabergé had to be on the bottle, specifically Fabergé Brut, not that Idel Labs crap that's out there now, but Fabergé Brut glass bottle, medallion, name on the rim of the bottle, the whole nine. And I was like, guess who just happens to have too many backups of that fragrance? Guess who has too many bottles of Brut? Because I've told you guys before, I had a period where I backed up too much stuff. So I was like, okay, I can hook you up. You want a bottle of pristine, probably 80s, I think. I don't think I have anything older than 80s, but pristine 80s era, New York, Fabergé Brut spray, 3-ounce spray bottle, the tall bottle, the cheap plastic cap on top, but it's got the metal medallion. So boom, put that in the box for him. Got the iron, put the iron in the box for him. Like I said, he already got Drakkar Noir. And then he was like, okay, I'm looking for this deep cut Avon fragrance. And it was a deep cut Avon fragrance that wasn't made for very long. And he was like, yeah, and my dad's girlfriend at the time was selling Avon, and it was a fragrance, and it was the Billy D. Williams fragrance, and that's why he bought it, because he liked Lando Calrissian and all this other stuff, and he drank Colt 45 too. He was really into Billy D, and he had his music too. He had his albums and everything. I was like, guess who happens to have too many backups of that too? I've got too many bottles of that. So I was like, you want a bottle of the undeniable for Men by Billy D. Williams? You want the Lando Calrissian fragrance? Put it in the box. Off it goes. And then he goes, what about Giorgio for Red? I bet you don't have that. He's like, I bet you don't have Giorgio for Red, because my dad loved that fragrance, the Giorgio for Men, Red for Men. He's like, that's really rare and expensive. I'm like, no, actually, you can still buy bottles of that at like Ross and TJ Maxx and Marshalls. I said, but let me save you $10, because that's how much it costs at those places. Like, let me save you $10. And once again, guess who has too many backups of that? So Red goes in the box. Now here's the big one, guys. The big one. He goes, all right, I bet you don't have this. It was this fragrance that had Russian character on the front, and it was called Tsar, like Tsar Nicholas before the Soviet Union, that was assassinated by the Bolsheviks. It's a green bottle. He said it's green bottle, you can't see through it, and he's like, my dad loved it, and it was a pretty good smell, and I'm looking for a bottle of that. He didn't even know the house, didn't know it was Van Cleef and Arpels, he just knew that it was called Tsar. Now I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, no, that's like a $400 or $500 bottle now on eBay. That's like super rare, super expensive, right? It's like so much money. And let me tell you what, okay, I fell in love with that fragrance like in 2017, 2018, and the bottles were all $25 all day long, anywhere. Again, you could find this stuff in discounters, physical retail discounters. You could find it in perfume shops in the mall, kiosks. Obviously, places like Fragrance Net and stuff had it too. $25, $30 all day. And you can get testers for even less. So I ended up with like 8 bottles. And some of them were vintage ones too, because I was friends with the former owner of a perfume store in Seattle who had like 4 testers of like original, like old, with again with the solid green bottles with the Russian character on it. And I know that's the one he would want. He wouldn't want the newer ones. He'd want that one because his dad had that one. So yes, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I put like a $500 bottle of Czar that I paid like maybe $20 for 7 years ago. I put that $500 bottle of Czar in that box, and I fucking gave it to him. Gave it to him. So I'm going to wrap up the video right here, Fragrant Stories Volume 2. But don't let it ever be said that I give a flying fuck about unicorns and rarity and all this bullshit. I only care when it affects my pocketbook. When I cannot afford to buy something. When I cannot afford to buy it, that's when I care about it. But if it comes to trading away or giving away to someone with a very specific emotional need, in this case it was reuniting with his father and trying to get his father's fragrances for him, I'm like, yes, I will put this ridiculously valuable bottle that any other ghoulish, caustic asshole would want to sell for $500. And I stuck it in that box and put that USPS label on it, that alongside the Brute and all the other things, and it went right to him for free because I don't care. And I hope his dad, and the few years of life he had left, enjoyed that Czar every day and was reconnected with that fragrance and the memories and everything. And now he has them because his dad has passed, so the bottles are back in his hands now. So now he gets to smell those and enjoy those and experience that bond he has with his dad with those fragrances. I care more about that than making $500 off of $20 that I spent whatever years ago. That's the end of this volume of Fragrant Stories. I can tell more later if you want to. This has been The Unlist, and thanks for watching.